So during my review of the latest Avenger movie, I realized I have this love-hate relationship with canon. And I kind of touched on this in Star Wars and with the retcon idea before, but I'm going to break this up a little. So let's talk about Star Trek. Very specifically, Star Trek canon. And today, that means talking about another YouTuber.
And welcome back to the heart of the stories we tell. I'm Rob the host, and this is another look deep into what makes a story, a theory on storytelling by a storyteller who believes that every story has merit. And tonight's episode is
Star Trek canon, lore reloaded. Alright, so let me start by just saying I'm a huge Star Trek fan from way back. But I'm only recently, because my beautiful girlfriend was super nice to me and got me a CBS All Access, binge watched all of Discovery. So I'm a little on Discovery lore, but everything else I know. Alright, so there is a rather interesting, I'm gonna go with debate, about how canon is handled in Star Trek. One of my favorite arguments is the original series isn't canon, because it just doesn't work. But at the same time, I mean, there's all sorts of weird little things. Now, this particular video is going to focus on the Borg. And the reason for this is because I just got through watching what was one of the best documentary type pullouts by this guy called Lore Reloaded. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about my own Star Trek canon problems and my love-hate relationship with it. And it has to do with counting photon torpedoes. I was a kid when I was watching Deep Space Nine and Voyager came out, and I had this article that I had read about how they were going to make all these changes to the ship over time, and they were going to do all this stuff. One of the things that just caught me interesting was in the first episode they mentioned they only had, I think it was 100, but there was a set number, so many photons. And I used to keep count. I used to have a little mark board next to my TV. This is before the days of DVR and in demand. So I'd watch each episode and I'd mark off every time they used a torpedo. And I was right for so long. I want to say it made it 2 seasons where I was right every time. And then all of a sudden there was an episode where they said the number of photons they have. And when they said it, I'm like, wait, there's one missing. And I remember my sister had this friend that she used to hang out with, and he called her almost every night. I think he kind of was sweet on her, although I didn't know that at the time. And he specifically said, wait, I need to talk to your brother, because he was a big Star Trek fan. And I remember him saying, did you see Voyager last night? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, did you notice they lost a torpedo? And at the time, I was just starting to get into reading novels, and I was really into reading comics. I really thought that this was some big hint. There was going to be like a big season finale or something where there was going to be a flashback and see that we fought these other creatures, and there was something. But then there was a later point when they just started firing photons like crazy, and point blank, keeping count just didn't work. The writers stopped caring about continuity. And maybe I should have stopped too, but it irked me. It got me really, really mad. How dare they not explain where they're getting those new photons from? And to a certain extent, I feel that way in comic books and movies and TV shows. Like, if you set something up, I expect you to follow it. Like, you get to set the rules, but once you set them, you can't break them. But alright, so that's my little Star Trek aside. But Lore Reloaded did this whole big thing about Borg continuity and how the Borg have changed and evolved over time. And first of all, Lore Reloaded is someone that I'm a big fan of. He puts a lot of work into his videos. Hopefully I'll remember to put a link down below. He's cool to listen to, and he's one of those people that does his homework. But just real quick, what I do here is I take apart stories, I examine them, and try to figure out how and why we tell them. If that sounds interesting to you, join us in this little community, because we're going to be taking a look, and this is going to be a 3-part series. So don't skimp out. Subscribe so that you can see every bit of it. But this part is specifically Lore Reloaded's look at the Borg and what it means to us here. Alright, so Star Trek has a loose idea of what canon is. What do I mean by loose? I mean, well, point blank. The original series was written with no concept of it. Not really. They just kind of had episodic episodes. They didn't know it was going to be this big of a deal. And then, boom, it became a big deal. And by the time the motion picture came out, they didn't really have a writer's Bible. They didn't really have all the rules down. It really got solidified in the next generation. And about the time of the third-ish movie. And they tried. They really did. They would go back and they would try and figure out what had been done before, and then tried to make things that traveled forward accordingly. And there's a lot of fun things, a lot of little Easter eggs we find in original series and next gen especially, but in Deep Space Nine too. Little things where we play back and forth. One of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine even pokes fun at the fact that the continuity doesn't always make sense, but that's okay because it's all for fun. Except it wasn't for me. Like I said, I was one of those people that was a stickler. Why do Klingons look different? Why does this? And so when shows like Discovery or Enterprise show better tech than they had in the original series, I'm like, oh, that's not right. But okay, as Lore Reloaded points out, there's a certain amount of psychology at play here with the Borg and the Federation. And the fact is that they're one and the same. Sort of. Thematically, in fact, point blank, I'm just going to say this. Discovery plays with that with the Klingons' way of viewing the Federation like the Borg. At the end of the day, they want to make themselves better by learning from everyone around them. The Borg do it aggressively, the Federation does it through tactics and through negotiation. And that's about all I can say before we hit the spoilers. But, I mean, spoilers for Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and the movies, I guess? Alright, so in Lore Reloaded's video, he talks about the fact that he had an interview with two different people. One he claims is an insider at Discovery but can't disclose who it is, and based on the things he says, I believe him. And the other one was a writer for Voyager. And to be honest, it's a little tiny bit interesting when you see the way these professional writers consider it, and the fact that there is a big amount of play between what the studios will let you do and what you have to do. Now, I personally am a big fan of the idea of a series Bible, but it gave me something to think about. If I were to sit down right now and write a Star Trek series, and I will tell you what I would write if it were the case, there is part of me that says, I'd be like, well, screw canon. I'm mostly interested in A, getting my stories out there, B, telling entertaining stories, and C, keeping my job that will entail me getting paid to be a writer. So if I need to break continuity, I break continuity. On the other hand, there's the part of me that feels that the best storytelling techniques are keeping continuity. So those are kind of at odds, but not really. See, this is where this gets interesting, because I think that little things don't matter so much. Did Spock ever mention he had a sister? No. But Spock never mentioned he had a brother either before he just all of a sudden did. And you know what? If I personally was working with James T. Kirk, I might not mention I had a sister. Just saying. But then I started thinking about how hard it would be to keep to any continuity. Just imagine you were sitting down to write Star Trek Discovery. You are told this story takes place before 90% of this stuff, but after the Enterprise series. Okay. You need to get the technology to fit right in between those two eras, but you also need the stories to be engaging and suspenseful. But you also need to make sure that every single thing you mention has some groundwork in something before. You could probably spend 6 months researching each episode. What drives me nuts in the way of Star Trek, though, is sometimes it seems like they really did that research. Like, they really sat there and did, like, hours of pouring stuff over. And then we get to Voyager, where it's like, we couldn't even consistently write within our own universe, within our own episode. Is the Queen an individual? Do the Borg adapt, or do they learn and grow? Depends on what's best for the episode. And again, I totally get that. Because there's part of me that says the original series didn't have much continuity in that regard either. All we had was how things were and what made the most fun episode. But it's this balancing act. Like, is it going to impact your enjoyment? Is the fact that Cisco says that this happened, but we know that Picard already said that that happened, and those two can't both be true, going to rip you out of the narrative? I'll be honest, it did with me with the new Avenger movie, and it has with me in Star Trek. One of the things that's just totally ridiculous, and totally you can write me off as being ridiculous in this. In Enterprise, they had phase cannons, and that was great. But they introduced, and they had missiles. But then they introduced photon torpedoes, and I knew for a fact that photon torpedoes were not introduced until the Romulan War. And we got photon torpedoes early because they just wanted to have photon torpedoes. On the other hand, most of what I've seen in Discovery, even though people give it a bunch of crap, I think can fit relatively easily. In fact, the end of Discovery did this whole thing where they wrapped up too much stuff and like bent over backwards to say, and we'll never talk about this ever again, that I felt ripped me out more than the base story. Because at the end of the day, it itself wasn't that continuity breaking. Some things make sense. And then there's also the difference between an update and a canon problem. See, at the end of the day, we are always wrong when we imagine where technology is going. Always. Normally we undershoot, sometimes we overshoot, but at the end of the day, could you imagine going back to 1975 and explaining every piece of technology you use on a daily basis? Yeah, it would seem like magic. So, yeah, the fact that they didn't have things as cool as we have now makes sense. But alright, so I'm curious what you think. Is canon important in general? And specifically, what he said in his interviews, where he said that the writers were constrained by canon sometimes, but sometimes also would go away from it. What do you think? And I'll talk about that more. But next I'm going to talk about the Avenger movie, because it should be safe from spoilers. And then I'm going to come back and do a general continuity episode. And I'll do any comments from this then. But for now, you know all the things. Like and share and subscribe. And a big thank you to my Patreons that help me get this stuff out to you, because I can't monetize. And if you really want to help out, click that subscribe button. Join us in this conversation. Because like I said, I will be pulling comments and answering questions. For now, though, I hope you have a good night. And thank you for walking with me through the heart of Continuity Part 1.